Now, Donald Trump has just blinked. So, between the staring match of Donald Trump and presidency from China, right, Donald Trump has finally blinked and he has started to walk back his tariff. Okay, so you can see over here, basically Donald Trump says in a recent interview that he hinted that the tariff on China will come down substantially. Now, this is a big departure from what he mentioned earlier on about going strong on China, calling them cheaters, calling them destroying the US economy, and he was adamant that he's going to use tariff to fix all this. But what prompted the change, right? And what do we see the stock market going forward from here? Let's dive straight into it. So Donald Trump hinted that the China tariff will come down substantially. However, even with this olive branch, it doesn't seem like China is taking it easy. After Trump's statement, reporters actually asked the Chinese government, is there such an issue and are there trade talks going on? However, they actually replied, no, there's no trade talks at all that's ongoing. And after the refusal, Donald Trump is like your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend that refused to admit the reality and still cling on to you after a separation. And you can see over here, Donald Trump still doubled down on his statement that there are ongoing talks with China, even when China refuted the claim. So what's the reason that caused Donald Trump to do a 180 turnaround and start to blink on this trade deal? Is really because China has strong-armed US into it. For example, over here, China mentioned that any countries that sides on the US side of the picture will face strong retaliation from China as well. And we all know right now with the whole tariff situation, actually everybody is not such a great friend with the US. And therefore, with this final statement, China is actually taking the rest of the allied friends from the United States. Another thing that was really crucial was this denial of rare earth materials from China to the US, right? Globally, China is the dominant player and producer of rare earth materials. So US are going to be starved of such materials and it's going to affect many of its industries. And in particular, its defense industry, and China is really targeting that, right? China started by asking Chinese firms to return Boeing its planes, right, that are already bought and meant for China. And on top of that, without all this rare earth material, it is hard to see how the US government and especially the defense industry can continue to produce all the weapons that it has used to produce. And all these import restrictions on raw materials will also hamper Trump's goal to rebuild the shipbuilding capability of the United States. Now, why is China hitting US in the defense area? Because this is perhaps the only segment that Beijing has always been subservient to and is of a lesser status. But with all the export restrictions and declining revenues to its defense complex such as Boeing, Lockheed Martin, there might be a good chance that China can finally overtake US on the defense sector. While US is giving a tit for tat for such restrictions, but honestly, some of the restrictions, for example, airplane restrictions, cotton restrictions, China can get those materials from other places. However, rare earth materials is truly unique to China, where it's overwhelming the dominant supplier of the global supply of rare earth material. Therefore, US have no other alternative, right, than to crawl back to China to ask for the raw earth material. Now, while US try to contain China by restricting the exports of advanced semiconductor chips to the Chinese companies. However, I think that only has a backfire effect because when you're restricting a nation's of access to high technology from you, guess what? China itself will have no choice but to rapidly develop and research and create better technology themselves. And that's what we are seeing right now. All the firms in China that used to depend on Nvidia for their AI chips are now turning their heads towards Huawei. So this restriction actually accelerates China's pace of development in AI technology, and this might actually push China to lead the world in terms of AI chip research and development. Another point that is a bit more subtle is the tourism revenue that US has been receiving from China. It is not just to tourists that used to visit the US a lot, but with all this uncertainty, actually the number of students going into the education segment in the US has dropped significantly. Now, if you look at this, in terms of university enrollment, actually a large proportion of them comes from China. So without this revenue, actually it will also impact the non-trade industries of the United States. However, with all this walking back on tariff and the tariff plan not working, actually Donald Trump is doubling down by saying that the petrol prices and grocery prices has actually started going down and effectively saying that inflation has gone down under his watch. But is that true? So let's look over here. The regular gasoline prices, if you compare it to 1 year ago, indeed it is actually lower. However, if you look at the last 3 months since Donald Trump take over office, it is hard to argue that the gasoline prices on the regular pump has actually gone down. And in terms of grocery prices coming down, this could not be further from the truth, right? This is from the FRED, where they look at the food at homes of US average cities. And you can see over here since January, actually the chart has only gone to the top right hand corner. So with China closing in and its tariff plan not working out and inflation not coming down, I think it is the main reason why Donald Trump is finally blinking and walking back on its tariff. But I think one thing to remember is that actually I don't think China wants to see the absolute and total collapse of the US economy, because US actually is still the largest consumer in the world, and guess what? He relies heavily on it, right? So the largest producer, China, will need US to continue to sustain in order to boost its economy. So it is kind of like the prisoner's dilemma, where you don't really like the person, but you rely on each other to survive, so you cannot afford the other party to collapse over here. And the thing is this, while China may have been selling the US debt, but China is still the second largest debt holder of United States. Should US choose to default on this is going to have a huge impact on the Chinese economy as well. So all in all, my personal belief is that whatever we are seeing in the stock market right now, the rapid decline in prices has finally come to a stabilization. I think this might be a local bottom. That's why I'm quite happy to start accumulating shares of good businesses and good companies from here, right? So what do you think? Do you think this is also going to be a local bottom, or are we heading to further lower prices, right? Put down in the comments, and I hope you guys like the analysis here. Do like and subscribe, and I'll see you at the next one.